You're in the cutoff. You look down at your cards and decide to open the pot for 2.13 big blinds. As everyone knows, that's the optimal cutoff sizing. The button folds, the small blind folds, the big blind makes the call, and you go heads up to a flop of 9 of spades, 7 of spades, 3 of diamonds. You ponder, sitting there in position, and quickly realize that you have no idea what on earth you're doing. But fortunately, an echo of a distant YouTube video from 17 months ago enters your brain, and it says, "This is a big cbet board." And you say, "Thank you, YouTube video from 17 months ago," and you go to make a big cbet, but then you realize you have no idea how to play a big cbet strategy, and you just regress to the following thought process.
I'm going to bet my range to simplify my strategy.
And you bet 1/3 pot. And villain folds, and that's the end of the hand, and you hate yourself because you want to be the sort of poker player that can do cool stuff like Linus Love or Pio Solver or lots of famous poker players like those two, and you want to go ahead and learn how to play a big cbet strategy. You want to know what to do if you check back and face a turn probe, how to do delayed c-betting after villain checks the turn to you, what you should do if you get raised, what kinds of hands you should bluff with, and how weak your bluffs can be. You want to know all of these things, so fast forward in time, you watch this video where I explain to you how to play a big bet strategy on 9-7-3 with a flush draw, meaning the board has a flush draw. Not that you have one, although you might. If you like this kind of content, check out Weapons of War and Carrot Corner. Arm yourself to the teeth this winter with 10 brand new bet sizes and lines that are devastatingly effective and theoretically sound, and just very good things to add to your game. Click the top link in the description after this video. Time is running out on that early bird discount. Got to be quick to save £100 on that course, but let's get into this video and become masters of 9 of spades, 7 of spades, 3 of diamonds, and all boards like it. Stop range betting. Stop hating yourself. Learn to play real poker. Sim outputs are confusing. They put people off. Some of you are watching this video and you're like, "Oh God, I don't want to look at a solver today. Can you just teach me in a more human way?" Don't worry, I'm going to teach you in a human way, but using a solver to illustrate. There are 9 classes of hands we can actually have on this flop, and we're going to chunk them together into categories to get you guys used to thinking about this in a more human, tangible way. The first category of hands we're going to look at is nutted hands. We're going to then move down into the thick value region. We're going to talk about thin value. We're going to talk about what we call the upper median, upper middle, sort of quite good hands, but usually these hands check a lot. Then we're going to talk about hybrids that do a lot of betting for multiple reasons. We are then going to talk about the lower middle hands that again do a lot of checking. We're then going to move into some unmade hand territory like draws, semi-trash, and of course, hopeless dog shit, everyone's favorite hand category. 9 categories in total. Let's get into them before we actually start looking at some other nodes where we don't bet the flop or barrel the turn or things like that. First off, nutted hands. These are going to be things like sets and 2-pair. As you can see here, pocket 7s, pocket 3s, pocket 9s, and 9-7 suited are all doing an absolute ton of betting. Editor, please circle 9s, 7s, 3s, and 9-7 suited. And that's because they're the nuts, and this is a pretty good way to go, especially if you're playing low stakes, micro stakes, where a lot of your money comes from just value betting against people who are calling you down a lot, but aren't really being all that aggressive. You don't really want to check these nutted hands on the flop, you just want to put that big bet in. You can do a bit of checking with certain combos like 9-7, at equilibrium against a solver or a tough opponent, but I wouldn't recommend mixing that in against weak opponents. You just want to get that pot building as soon as possible. Second hand category is thick value. This is a hand like pocket aces. Aces is very far from a nutted hand here because in terms of equity, aces comes in about 82%, whereas pocket 9s has 91%, pocket 7s 90%, etc. When you put this into terms of EV, it's even more stark. The starting pot here is $9, right? Or 9 bananas, whatever you want to call it. Aces is worth 11 bananas, 10.9, but pocket 9s is worth 24. So pocket 9s is 2.5 times better than aces here. It's worth between 2 times and 3 times the pot. It's a huge hand. That's why we call aces thick value. We don't refer to it as the nuts. Thick value hands on boards that are semi-wet like this, where there's a flush draw, where you're never going to have like an enormous amount of equity with your hand, are not actually mandatory bets. You might think, oh, I've got to bet to deny equity to flush draws and straight draws, but actually you don't, because checking has a lot of merit to it as well. When you check back with a hand like aces, you give your opponent the chance to bluff the turn or hit the turn with a hand they would have folded on the flop. Yes, you protect your checking range. That's not the primary reason for doing it. That is a bonus if you're trying to construct a solid strategy against a decent player. And do you know what, guys? In real life, people do lead the turn. They probe the turn very often if you do check. And so checking back with aces is a very underrated line and a good thing to do. On a board like this then, when you're playing the big bet strategy, 7 into 9 is the option we have here. We're going to be checking aces quite a lot of the time because it's just a lot less vulnerable than a hand like 10s or jacks. 10s, jacks, and aces, they all have similar amounts of propensity to get value. They're all crushing a 9 by similar margins, although jacks is slightly less far ahead because if villain has king 9, they have more outs against you than if you have kings and they have king 9, for example. But the big picture here is that the more vulnerable the overpair is, the more frequently that hand is going to want to bet. This also carries down into hands like ace 9, king 9. The thicker it is for value, the better it is, the more often it's going to be betting. You can see here with the 9x that we actually start to move from the thick value region into the third category for today, which is thin value. When you have a thin value hand like 9-8 or 10-9 or jack-9 or something like that, or pocket 8s, it's not that you can't bet, although 8s is kind of fussy about the suit there. It wants to bet only with the spade, where the set outs are better and where your opponent's flush draws have lower equity. But you do need to be a bit careful as you start moving down your range that you're not committing the dreaded polarization mistake. And this is one of the biggest errors that people make when they first switch over to big cbets on boards like this. They just end up betting too low down into their made hands. Usually this happens because people are favoring protection or just really wanting the hand to end, or not being able to tolerate the idea of their opponent getting a free card with a gut shot or something like that. But when you do have a hand like pocket 8s, when you get that all the way down into something like 6s or 5s or 4s or a really bad 9 or a 7x combo with a bad kicker, we're actually moving now into the realms of what we call the upper median or upper middle. It's a type of hand that is actually just too mediocre to want to put a lot of money into the pot right now. 10-7, jack-7, pocket 8s, not super vulnerable either, just a little bit vulnerable and very middling, and that is the sort of hand that will actually perform a little bit better as a check than it will as a big bet. If you're playing your range bet, small bet strategy, you can bet these hands. They don't exceed their investment ceiling for a small bet, but they do for a big bet. So when you're constructing in this way, you should check those upper, median, middling hands. The next category down is called a hybrid, and it's going to be something like ace-king or ace-3, king-3, something like this. Bottom pair is notoriously happy to bet because it's very, very vulnerable. Sometimes it can make better hands fold, like mediocre to bad pocket pairs, and it's going to have really nice sort of disguised trips and two-pair draws that are typically really live and quite undominated because it's quite hard to connect with the bottom card of a flop because people fold those really low baby cards pre-flop a lot, right? So something like king 3 and ace 3 is a mixed bag of reasons for betting the flop. You're getting some folds from better, you're cleaning up a lot of equity, and if you do get called, well, you might have the best hand, or you might just be drawing to 5 really nutty outs. If you've got king 3 here, both the king and the 3 are fantastic things to hit on the turn. All of that combined makes this hand reasonable to bet on the flop. You're way more likely to remember that you can bet a hand like king 3 but not 10-7 here if you remember the reasons behind it. And that's why we're educating you on this channel about why solvers play in this way and not just trying to copy them like some sort of parrot. This is carrot corner, remember? Not parrot corner. Yeah, we've done that joke before. Moving on. Lower median hands are things like decent ace highs. It's a bit weird here, right? Because you can see that ace-king suited is betting and ace-queen suited without the flush draw is just checking. And the reason for that is that, well, ace-king is just a bit more of a value bet than ace-queen. And then when you get down into these lower ace-x down here, they can sort of bet, but it's more for a bluff reason. You'll also notice that ace-x with the backdoor straight draw and stuff like that and backdoor flush draw is going to usually be betting at a bit of a higher frequency. And that's just normal solver stuff. But yeah, when you're down here in this lower median range of having ace queen or something like that, that's another sort of hand that you just want to be checking. So The reason I call that lower median is that we noted before that 10-7 and Jack-7, pocket 8s and pocket 6s and 5s are mostly checking, and then suddenly there's a little bit of betting with Ace-3, King-3 and Ace-King, and then it goes back down into like mostly checking again with Ace-10, Ace-Queen, Ace-Jack. There's a bit of fluctuation there. Don't get lost in solver noise, guys. Why is Ace-Jack betting more often than Ace-10? Even though it's got more showdown value, it's going to be to do with the fact that you can make straights, the backdoors, the jack being more of a nutted over card. There's going to be some reasons for it, but let's not get lost in the weeds here. Moving down the range, we then come to the draws. Draws are optional bets on the flop. Most people do not put enough draws in their checking range because they just see them as like auto cbets. But if we go to a hand here, even like quite a good looking draw, like the Jack-8 of spades, that combo draw, you do not have to bet the flop with that. And to understand this, let's look at what happens on the check branch. On the check branch, you're very often going to hit the turn. You'll hit a pair, a flush, or a straight. And when you do, your opponent will sometimes have hit a second best hand, or they will lead the turn with a hand that would have folded the flop as a bluff. These are some advantages. The disadvantage of betting the flop is that a streak goes past without you building, or you don't make your opponent fold some hand that then hits top pair in the turn and beats you out of a pot that you would have won had you bet the flop. There's pros and cons on different branches of the tree. Sometimes good things happen, sometimes bad things happen, but overall, with the jack high flush here, you're not craving a giant pot necessarily. A jack high flush does want to put some money in for value, but it's not the sort of hand that if you do bet the flop, bet the turn and jam the river all in or something, that you're super happy when called, unless you're against like a mega whale or something like that. So for most draws, you do not have to actually bet the flop. You can check the nut flush draw, you can check the second nut flush draw, but you will notice that the solver tends to gravitate towards putting more money in the pot with the nutted flush draws and less money in the pot with the weaker ones. That's a normal pattern. You can see here that certain draws like 6-5 that are combo draws are betting more often, but when you get into the realms of just like a kind of rubbish queen high flush draw, it's actually checking about as much as it's betting. So it is a nifty thing to do, especially against competent opposition, to actually put some of these flush draws in your checking range, understanding that they are very far from mandatory bets and that there is merit on the check branch and bad things can happen on the bet branch as well. It's not just simply better to bet than to check with these hands. Then we move down into the domain of semi-trash or semi-trash, depending on which side of the Atlantic Ocean you reside, and this is the sort of hand that is the most misplayed when people are trying to build big c-bet strategies. If you're playing 25NL, right, which all of you are, I know that you're all playing that stake, what happens is your opponents, when they big c-bet, they're gravitating heavily towards 10-8 suited, Jack-8 of spades, King-5 of spades, and heavily away from hands like King-8 of hearts. But King-8 of hearts is a very high frequency c-bet in the solver. It's betting around the global frequency here for range, which is 45%. In fact, it's betting a bit more at 49% of the time. And the reason it's doing a lot of betting is it's a bad hand. Big c-bet strategies should be polarized. You should be betting quite a lot of really quite lousy hands. Not total dog shit though, which we'll come to in just a second. So these almost hopeless hands, these semi-trash hands that have maybe an overcard, a backdoor, some means of improving, but they're certainly not hands we're very excited about, they're still going to be doing a ton of betting when we're concocting a big c-bet strategy, and by far the most common mistake that people make when trying to build this strategy is that they just never bet the flop with King-8. They're like, I have better hands in my range to bluff with, I have better bluffs, but this, as we know from the Carrot Poker School, is a fallacy. We shouldn't be comparing a hand we have to one we don't have. Rather, we should be looking at the EV of betting our hand and checking our hand, and if that's equal, then the solver is going to mix. In real life, a couple of really cool things happen. One is that you don't get raised enough on the flop when you bet usually, and the second one is that people overfold to c-bets. So when you do have a hand like King-8, it's actually better to bet than to check against certain opponents who are going to lead the turn at you a lot if you check, but not raise enough and fold a lot if you bet. Against certain recreational players, I would always bet King-8 on the flop. I might bet a bit smaller as an exploit, but I'm practically always betting that hand against a recreational player. And finally, we come to the lowest of the low, the absolute total dog shit. It takes a lot of very bad things to happen to you in order for you to not be able to c-bet this flop as a bluff. The first thing that has to happen is that you have no backdoor flush draw. The second thing that has to happen is that you have a really terrible looking overcard, like just one overcard that's a queen or a king or something like that. And the third thing that has to happen is that your second card has to be really low and actually not be an out against second pair. When all of that is true, you can deem your hand total dogshit, as in the case of Queen 4. But as soon as that kicker gets as high as a 6, you can see that the hand is no longer total dogshit, it's now just semi-trash. And as we know, semi-trash does a ton of betting. Okay, so that's the 9 hand categories. I hope you're now more equipped to look at your hand, see where it fits in, and roughly emulate whether you should be mixing, betting, or checking. Remember, there's a whole exploitative layer to this as well, where against certain opponents, betting might just be better with some hand, against others, checking might be better. You have a look at your opponent, try and figure that out. That's a whole new realm that we're not really going to get into today. Okay, let's move on to the next section of this now, which is how to play the subsequent nodes. Let's say that you do actually go ahead and check the flop, right? You're going to be doing that 55% of the time here at Equilibrium. You're doing a lot of checking. And let's say the turn comes down some innocuous looking card like the 4 of clubs. Your opponent has this mess of a probe strategy, but let's just say that they decide to lead out for the mediocre sizing here and just bet 7 into 9. They go for a B75 on the turn, which is going to happen pretty often. One of the cornerstones of playing a big cbet strategy is handling turn probes, because you're going to face a turn probe really often after you check back on the flop, right? When you cbet range on the flop, you're not used to facing turn probes, right? That node doesn't exist. Villain either raises, calls, or fold, and you either have a facing raise spot or a turn barrel spot, or it's the end of the hand. You don't face turn probe. But when you're playing a big cbet strategy, you check back a lot more, and you do face turn probes. Humans are bad at constructing these. The first thing you should know is that exploitatively, their turn probe range will be too merged, too weak, and if they check the turn a second time, they'll be too underprotected, right? That's the exploits you need to be aware of in these spots. But let's start with a look at the theory on how we react to someone betting 75% of the pot here on a relatively blank turn, like the 4 of clubs. Now, as you can see, lots of the calling range here for in position after they check back the flop is actually a good hand that they check back on the flop with. So you can see what the biggest mistake is that my students would have here. It's actually what we call their landing range on this turn. If you go back to the flop, they have not checked aces enough, kings enough, any of these combos. They've just bet their top pair, they've bet their overpairs, they've bet their flush draws. So if you were to remove lots of the flush draws and overpairs and top pairs from this range, then all of the calling hands like aces, kings, queens, ace 9, king 9, queen 9, jack 9, some sort of flush draw, are all just gone at quite a high frequency. And so the natural result is that a human who checks back this flop, who's trying to build a big bet strategy, exposes themselves to the horrors of a probe monkey. Someone who just probes automatically. They're printing. If you're a probe monkey at 25 and L, if you're literally just like, he checks, so I bet, yes, you're going to print money. You're going to kill the population. You can play like an absolute buffoon, and you can destroy the population here. So in order to not get destroyed when you're learning the big cbet strategy, the first thing to do is just arm yourself in the first place by checking back some of these big hands that aren't nutted. Remember, those ones bet, that are able to go for 2 streets to fill in checks now, and are able to call or even raise a turn bet for value. You want to load those up into your range. You also want to load up some draws, right? So you've got your jack 8, your gutters that can continue with the nut straight draw. Planning to bluff river, of course, if you miss 10-8, similar idea. Flush draws, etc. You do also have to continue with some underpair type stuff. So you're going to be calling pocket 8s. That functions as a value beater. It's beating some of the 7x your opponent's going to lead the turn with. You're also going to be calling with pair plus straight draw hands like 6s and 5s. If you do have a really low, miserable underpair here, though, the only example of that is deuces. You're going to be folding, instead favoring hands like ace-king to call with, because ace-king is basically the same hand as deuces, but has way more outs against something like 7x or 9x. When it comes to your folding range, any 2 big cards that don't have as much showdown value that are going to block bluffs more, stuff containing the 10 or the jack here are going to block more bluffs than stuff containing the king or the queen, because the opponent is naturally leading with a lot of cards around the 9 and the 7 as a bluff, straight draws, etc. That's why you're calling with ace-king sometimes, but you're pretty much always folding a hand like king-jack. King-jack also just has less showdown value, and you would have to bluff river with some of these broadways if you were to ever win. So it's just not really favourable to float the turn bet here with queen jack of clubs and then have to bluff the river if you miss, and you know the hand isn't drawing to as good outs anyway. So you can just fold the worst of your overcards, call with your really big overcards here, call with all of your pocket pair, second pair, middle pair. A pair on the board is infinitely better than a pair off the board. The reason for that is just that you have more outs, right? And you're blocking more of your opponent's value. So there's a big difference here between having pocket deuces and having bottom pair like king 3 or something like that. King 3 is infinitely better. It's a way, way better bluff catcher. The other thing that you're probably doing wrong here when you face turn probes is you're probably folding too many of your gut shots and straight draws because you're thinking, this is a big bet. I don't have the odds to call. But when you have a combination of position, implied odds, and future fold equity, you do not want to be folding here with a hand like Jack 8 suited. You want to be calling that. You want to be calling Jack 10. These have pair draws as well. Even if you just have a hand like Queen 6 here or King 6, you want to be calling that too. And actually, if you look at the EV difference here between calling and folding, it's a pretty damn big mistake not to call here with a hand like King 6. It's costing you, okay, it's not a huge mistake, but it is costing you 0.15 of a chip or 15 cents in a 1-2 game. And that does kind of add up over time. So it's more of a mistake than you might think to fold a hand like King 6 here. With respect to the raising, when you face the turn probe, I wouldn't really worry about it too much. You don't want to do a lot of raising here, but I will tell you one thing. Against humans, they'll probe too merged, they'll probe too many combos, so it will be quite good to go ahead and raise a hand like pocket queens if you have got there with that vulnerable and very high equity overpair. All right, moving on to the node now where it goes check, check on the flop, and they check to us on the turn. Let's get the exploit stuff out of the way first, because it is just really important to know. This is a very underprotected node. We talk about this a lot in Weapons of War. We have episode 2, which is called the delayed cbet Swiss Army knife, meaning there are lots of different options that you can deploy. That course goes a bit more into detail on how to use those and what they are, but let's keep it simple for now. The main go-to sizing on the turn when you are checked to, again, by the big blind, in the delayed cbet node is going to be the middling sizing. It's going to be the B75, right? And the way that we can actually build this, if we want to simplify things, is we can go into the tree and pile solver and actually restrict things so that we're only using that sizing. To do that, I just went to tree at the top of pile solver and I went to create subtree configuration. You don't need to do this if you don't use pile. Don't worry about this part of the video. I'm just showing you in case you do happen to use pile solver. So you can then say that the only turn sizing is going to be the B75 here, and you will just rebuild the tree and rerun the solver, and that's going to solve very quickly because it's just going to be a very small game tree. So you can see it's already solving there down to the required accuracy. It's not going to be long at all. And that's it done. So now when we go back into the tree here, we can see that after the second check, the check on the turn of the deuce of hearts here, we only have one sizing, which is betting 7 into 9. And this is a nice simplified strategy and how to actually concoct that. There are some boards where you do want to start using overbets as delayed cbets. There are also boards where you do want to use blocks. But if you're a bit newer to the game, then keep it simple for now and just get used to how to build the B75 in the meantime. So the way you want to do this is, again, you're going to be respecting polarization, and again, you're going to be respecting vulnerability. So when you do have a hand here like pocket jacks or pocket queens, you're going to be combining very thick value, having a very high equity hand, with having a semi-vulnerable hand, and you're just going to always want to be betting. When you have aces, though, you're going to block ace high, which is one of the main calling hands for your opponent if it's a good ace high, and you're also going to be completely stable. That's the opposite of vulnerable, and so you can actually check that hand back a second time. That's right, the EV you get by unblocking villain's river bluffs and getting villain to bluff the river or hit the river and then be able to get money in that way is going to compensate for the lost ground when villain just has a 7 that would have called you or 6s that would have called you here. There is a trade-off. There are pros and cons on each side of the game tree. Moving on, you're going to have some thin value hands here as well that are just optional bets. Things like 10-9, Jack-9, Queen-9, they can bet big. But once we get into the realms of pocket 10s, King-9, Ace-9, Jacks, Queens, you're just basically always betting. 8s now has been upgraded. We got a really bricky turn, a very good turn for 8s. Villain checked again. Both of those things have enhanced the equity of pocket 8s, and it can now go for a value bet. There is still an upper median, an upper middle, hands like 6s, 5s, 4s. Ace, King, Ace, Queen, Ace, Jack have now been boosted in showdown value by the fact that they're one step closer to showdown. The turn has been good for them, meaning they're just very much in the camp of showdown value at this point. And if you're just playing a big bet here, you won't be reopening any ace high. If you are dabbling in the realms of block bets here, and there are exploitative reasons to want to do that, then you'll be betting some of this ace high, but don't worry about that for now. Moving down into the bluff domain then. Oh, by the way, there's still a bit of weird hybrid stuff going on with ace deuce or king 3. We talked about the reasons for that on the flop, although it is mostly just a value-ish denial bet. It's battered my mic. Just a value denial bet with something like king 3 of spades. But moving down on into the draw region and bluff region, you'll actually see that draws on the turn, so let's just pick something like the king 6 of spades, are once again just optional hands. You don't have to bet them. You don't. Even a hand like 10-8 or Jack-8, which in GTO is an optional bet, this feels unnatural. It feels like we should always be betting this hand. And that probably comes from the fact that this is a very good fold equity spot. The way we want to play this spot against humans is that we want to be bluffing a lot more than this. Not just with our flush draws and our straight draws and hands like that, but even moving down into the realms of the semi-trash, which, as we know, on the flop was able to bet a lot. That doesn't change on the turn, and a delayed cbet node, something like king 6 of hearts, is still able to pull the trigger here and make a bluff. Don't get stuck in the we have better hands to bluff fallacy thought process. Don't compare your hand to hands you don't have. Compare the EV of bet to the EV of check. You can bet king 6 here. Moving down into the realms of the utter dog shit, there are still some hands that are just too bad to bet with, but they are very few and far between. You'd be much safer, guys, just assuming that your trash looking hand is good enough to bluff with in theory and just bluffing it, because against humans there is nothing wrong with even betting here with queen 4 of clubs. There is nothing wrong with that. Yes, the hand is pure checking in GTO, but no, it will not be a big EV swing, and humans are under raising, under protecting, and overfolding on this node. The most important thing for me to stress here is that the bluffs you make, particularly with low equity hands and semi-trash, are going to overperform on this node against humans, and so you should be more inclined to bet the turn like an absolute madman or woman, a crazy person, a maniac, if villain checks to you a second time at low stakes and micro stakes, because they're just way overfolding. If you bet here for 75% pot, they're meant to be folding more than your break-even point, more than MDF, because they are at a range disadvantage. They're meant to be folding 54% of the time in a spot where the MDF would cause them to only want to fold about 43% of the time. So that's already an overfold based on the math, and that's based on range disadvantage. But in the real world, humans are probably folding 65, 70% of the time on this node. No joke, something like that. So wielding that B75 and not being shy about doing it really, really lightly is a very good thing to do. But, you know, respecting polarization and not going ahead and just betting with sixes, but rather betting with the polarized range. King 6 is much more of a bet here than pocket 5s, but people get that backwards. They're not bluffing enough of the low EV stuff. That's the number one mistake to avoid when you're delayed c-betting, especially against humans who are going to overfold. Well, guys, that took a bit longer than planned. There is honestly so much stuff I could say about this spot. We haven't looked at what happens when we bet the flop and face raises yet, nor have we looked at what happens when we have the chance to double barrel the turn. We do have a video from a few weeks back about double barreling the turn with trash. That's definitely one I'd recommend checking out. And yeah, Weapons of War is a good way of building on this and just adding loads more lines to your toolkit. But the main point about the big c-bet, if you are going to start building this one in, if you are just one of those players that usually range bet small and gets on with it, is that you need to understand polarization fully. And the main motto from today is polarization and big c-bet strategies are not about just betting high equity hands. They're about having that proper definition in your range, about understanding the 9 different hand classes and how they behave and why. Because if you understand that from the flop, you'll be able to understand that from the turn or the river. The big mega course at Carrot Corner that goes through the whole workings of the game in depth in this sort of style, but PowerPoints and pretty graphics instead of just solvers, is the Carrot Poker School. That's what I'd recommend doing if you want to build on this. If you are going to invest in something for the long term, that's my recommendation. If not, keep watching this YouTube channel, keep letting us know what you want to see, and we'll bring you guys the right sort of free content to bring your game on. But let us know what you want that to be. Your feedback on that is very important to us, and we'll see you back here for another video very soon. Have fun using that big c-bet. Bye for now.